Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil Village VR. Village of Shadows difficulty, no damage, no extra content items, no infinite ammo walkthrough. This will cover the entire game in one single video, and we are starting off in this encounter right here. And this is the very first time that I'm ever doing a walkthrough of a PSVR 2 game, and I decided to start with Resident Evil Village and not Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, just to set the baseline for how this would go, and then get on to Resident Evil 4 Remake VR when given the chance. So, Resident Evil Village VR, as you can probably tell from my blind playthrough, or rather my playthrough, because I had to play through hardcore difficulty to unlock Village of Shadows difficulty for some bizarre reason, even though in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, you don't have to play through hardcore difficulty to unlock professional difficulty, so I don't understand why it works so differently with Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, but at least that's a good thing I can appreciate about Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But in Resident Evil Village VR, the VR saves are classed differently to the original game saves, so you have to play through hardcore difficulty to unlock Village of Shadows difficulty, which is annoying. So I wasn't able to get a genuine blind playthrough experience, but if you watch my playthrough of Resident Evil Village VR, I voiced a lot of negativity towards this game, or rather this game mode, I should be saying, and it doesn't hold up so much now, but there are still some things that I don't like about this VR mode, and honestly, the original version of Resident Evil Village is a lot better than the VR experience for Resident Evil Village, whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake, the VR experience, in some cases, is actually better than the original pre-alpha version of Resident Evil 4 Remake, and getting the chance to talk about both of these VR experiences is a very interesting idea to do, which is why I wanted to start with Resident Evil Village VR first. And as you can see right here, I just dealt with this Lycan, so you're seeing some of the mechanics in Resident Evil Village VR being displayed here, and these mechanics would actually transfer on to Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, and what I was doing with that first Lycan was I was holding the knife in a particular way, so you pull your knife out of your left arm, which is a cool design choice, and I don't know why Resident Evil 4 Remake doesn't have that option to put the knife on your left arm rather than on your chest. But you use your knife and then you press, I believe it's the R2 button, or it's the button that you assign to your pointer finger or whatever it is. But you press the pointer finger button and you change your grip on the knife, and so you change it to be an offhanded grip. And this allows you to do the stab animation with the knife. And the stab animation is a lot more effective than just the regular slash animation, because the hit detection on the stab animation is a lot better than the slash animation. And more hits just seem to register when you're using the stab animation rather than the slashing animation with that other grip. And what I was essentially doing was taking advantage of the counter that you can do with the Lycans, where if you and the Lycan are standing on flat ground, or you are below a Lycan and you hit them in the head at the right moment when they start their attack, you will get a very specific stun animation that will then cause the Lycan to lunge forward and grab you. And when he grabs you, if you shake your arms, you will be able to push him off of you before he has a chance to bite you, and you can just repeat this process. And anytime the Lycan goes into that stun animation where you hit him in the head, you have a brief opportunity to hit him with a couple of additional knife hits before he grabs you, and you have to re-engage that push again. And that is how that goes. That's probably the developer intended way to do that. I just don't understand why it's not designed very well, because again, you have to stand on flat ground or you have to be below the Lycan. If you are above the Lycan, like if your elevation is slightly higher than the Lycan's elevation, the counter just doesn't register. And I have no idea why a counter that is tied to a hit from a knife or from your bullet has anything to do with elevation. It doesn't make any sense. But you repeat that process a couple of times, and then you'll be able to kill the Lycan and begin this sequence, which is very simple, and I honestly prefer this compared to the Village Siege from Resident Evil 4 Remake. The Village Siege in Resident Evil 4 Remake is way worse than this, because at least this siege in Resident Evil Village has a consistent method for ensuring that you're not getting screwed by poor designs. It works every single time. Whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake, you have to be very technical with your approach, with first using stealth to lure enemies to very specific spots, throwing a grenade to kill most of them, but the grenade damage is so inconsistent in Resident Evil 4 Remake, and if that's the case, you have to then finish off the stragglers with your pistol. This causes the reinforcements to spawn in, then you have to run to the house with the shotgun, try to eliminate most of the ganado with every single shotgun shell, and if that is not enough, you then have to use the other grenade, or just dispatch the rest of the ganado with your pistol, and that's the end of the sequence. Like, it's a really dumb sequence, and honestly, the poor designs are more rampant in Resident Evil 4 Remake than in Resident Evil Village. Like, Resident Evil 4 Remake has at least allowed me to like Resident Evil Village a lot more. And it's great to come back to Resident Evil Village to do another walkthrough. I mean, I did say I would do another walkthrough of a Resident Evil game at some point to get a break from Resident Evil 4 Remake, and that didn't really come for a while. But now that I've done Resident Evil 4 Remake VR and had the urge to come to this VR version of Resident Evil Village, I've found a lot of enjoyment from doing this walkthrough again, even though there were definitely parts of Resident Evil Village VR that weren't that enjoyable, but I will explain them when I get the chance. But what I'm doing right now is just holding off the Lycans. They will never think to come through the floor or in the ground so long as you do this on the very first instance, when you do the sequence for the first time or you restart the checkpoint. So as long as you do not go near that hole, they will just come to this barricade and you'll be able to hold them off with your pistol shots, and then eventually you'll get it where a Lycan is just on one side of the barricade and he can't break through the barricade. Of course, sometimes he can hit the barricade, so if you notice the barricade shaking, you've got to hit the Lycans off of the barricade so that you'll be able to re-engage the whole process of ensuring that one Lycan is just busy breaking nothing, and then the other Lycan is trying to break through, but you're holding him off with the pistol until eventually he dies. And it's a pretty simple process, and it works very well. Now we're moving on to this sequence right here. So you're seeing a lot of the VR mechanics on display here. So as you can see right here, when you're trying to open drawers or you're trying to do other actions in this VR experience, you have to hold the grab button on your controller and physically grab onto them. In certain cases, you don't have to, like when you're picking up objects. It's kind of unclear initially when you first start Resident Evil Village VR which interactions require you to grab onto objects and which interactions can just simply be interacted with like the X prompt. But at least on Village of Shadows difficulty, after you went through hardcore difficulty, you do have a better understanding of where those interactions are. Of course, I haven't played this mode in a long time, so I'm a little rusty with when I need to interact with something physically or when I have to press X, so there can be those kind of moments with that, but overall, this was a pretty good walkthrough, I have to say. But we're just taking the time to pick up some more loot. So, the knife on this game. So, the knife has some additional mechanics that are kind of unnecessary for Resident Evil Village VR, because, as I've already explained in my Resident Evil Village retrospective, the knife just doesn't have a lot of utility in this game. They don't really encourage it the right sort of way, like Resident Evil 7 did. And so, a lot of the additional mechanics, like being able to throw the knife and actually dealing damage to enemies, is kind of pointless. I mean, it can be useful if you're trying to break things from a distance and just save yourself some time. But that's really all the new mechanics of the knife are good for. I mean, aside from the change with the grip, I like the fact that you can change your grip on the knife and do stabbing animations, because it improves the hit detection on your knife when you're trying to attack enemies, and that's really good. And it also allows you to knife a bit faster. Of course, you don't knife too quickly. There is a bit of a cooldown in between your hits before it actually registers a certain hit. So you can't just go all crazy with swinging your knife, because some of those hits will not be registered. Of course, it's not to the same degree as Resident Evil 4 VR. I think the cooldown is slightly less in Resident Evil Village VR compared to Resident Evil 4 VR on the Oculus Quest 2. So there can be some utility there, but obviously there's no real need to use the knife because the enemies are very beefy and the knife just doesn't elicit enough hit stun for it to be useful. Oh, and also I hate this. You have to physically turn on your flashlight by grabbing it from your coat and picking it up and then turning it on and then putting it back in your coat. I'm not a big fan of that change with the inventory assignment feature. So, like, there's stuff in your coat that you have to grab onto by opening your coat and then using your other hand to pick up the stuff, and it can be very clunky like that, and for some reason, they do put a weapon slot into your coat, so you have to open up the left-hand side of your coat in order to pick up whatever weapon is in there. At least in my case, it doesn't matter because there's no kind of like common weapon that I'm using that I'll be picking out of my jacket for anytime soon. The only weapon I ever keep there is just the Magnum. The rest of the weapons are not a problem to handle because the weapon slots are perfectly fine where they are. You have a weapon slot right in front of your waist on the right-hand side. You have one over your right shoulder, and you have a weapon slot behind your waist on the right-hand side. So that's 3 weapon slots that aren't inside the jacket, which is good, but your pipe bombs and your mines are forcefully going to be inside the jacket. Your pipe bombs are on the left-hand side of your jacket, and your mines are on the right-hand side. And also right there, I made sure to plant 2 mines so that I can spawn attack these Morieka. This is still, like, a crappy first boss, but honestly, I would say the El Gigante in Resident Evil 4 Remake is a worser first boss than this. I'm not counting Delago because Delago is just a gimmick fight. In fact, in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, you can kill Delago in less than a minute because of the changes with the controls with the harpoon, and it's really nice. But talking about Bella, you have to plant your mines in those specific spots to spawn attack the Morieka, and then use your pipe bomb to get rid of them. If one is still alive, just finish it off with 1 shotgun shell. They'll be pretty weakened by then, and then you can focus all your attention on Bella. So one of the things that I do not like about Resident Evil Village VR is the movement. Because of the fact that Resident Evil Village was already a first-person experience, I didn't change up the movement system whatsoever. So the issue where your turning animation eats your input for sprinting is an issue. So the amount of times you're going to be trying to run away while you're busy turning, and Ethan refuses to sprint because of this poor design choice from the developers is really annoying. So you have to use the quick turn feature on VR, just like in the main experience. To quick turn in VR, you have to make sure it is enabled in the settings, and you have to pull back on the right thumbstick in order to quick turn. And it's a very fast quick turn, just like in Resident Evil 4 VR on the Oculus Quest 2. So that's good to see that they took influences from that game, even though apparently New Capcom did not have any input. It was Armature Games that developed Resident Evil 4 VR, but I would honestly say that Armature Games is a better VR developer than New Capcom. I don't really think a lot of the designs in Resident Evil Village VR and Resident Evil 4 Remake VR are conducive to a development team that is very familiar to VR, but I'll explain them when I get the chance. But this strategy for Bella, what you have to do is you have to sprint away from her grab, because her grab has one of the worst hitboxes in Resident Evil Village, because you cannot crouch under it. You have to run the gamut with your crappy movement and run away from her at the right moment so that you can avoid the bad hitbox on that grab. And then if you stay close to Bella, she'll be forced to do her 4-hit combo 2 times. And what you'll notice is I crouch under the first 2 hits, and then on the 3rd hit of the combo, I shoot my pistol, because that 3rd hit on the combo has a really crappy hitbox. It will hit you even when you're crouching, unless you shoot Bella and you ensure that you're pretty low to the ground even when you are crouched. I mean, I'm not all the way down on the ground, like I'm not literally like touching the ground on my end when I'm doing that. I'm just making sure that I'm not looking up, because the direction of where you look is a massive factor to consider in the way it affects Ethan's hitbox in Resident Evil Village. So taking this into consideration, the general pattern is you sprint away from Bella's grab, stand close to her, make sure you avoid the 4 hits in your combo accordingly by crouching under the first 2 hits, and while you're crouched, you shoot your gun at her, and specifically the pistol, because trying to use the shotgun is very awkward because it passes right through her. So you can literally shoot through Bella without damaging her if you use the shotgun, which is problematic. So you have to use the pistol. This sole use of the pistol is a massive deviation from how I approached Bella in Resident Evil Village on the original version, because I would often use my shotgun at the start, but here I had to use my pistol because the shotgun just wasn't cutting it with the strategy that I had in mind in order to balance out Bella and get around her poor designs. So you just repeat that whole process that I discussed a couple of times, and eventually she'll go down. Sometimes, this is very rare, she can hit you even when you shoot her during the 3rd hit of the combo, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think it's mainly with Cassandra where it's an issue, because the floor isn't exactly flat. But right here, I opt to run towards Lady Dimitrescu and then get around her and get around this Morieka, and then make sure I pull the lever up so that I can open the door. And on the VR version, you do have the ability to use your left hand to pick up your weaponry during the sequence, but it's completely worthless and not really needed, because of course there's only 2 Morieka here, and good luck trying to use your shotgun with one hand, or using your pistol, or anything like that, or even be able to reload for that matter. It's too bad Ethan can't reload the same way as he did in Resident Evil 7 when he was fighting against Mia during this little sequence. but it's only for one sequence that lasts for less than a minute. And turning keys in Resident Evil Village VR is a big pain in the ass. You have to make sure that when you insert a key into a keyhole that you are going rather slowly with turning, because if you try to turn the keys very fast, they don't register properly. Like, the actual detection on turning keys is pretty bad. So take it nice and slowly when you are trying to use keys on doors. And right here, you've got to lure the Morieka away from this door so that you have plenty of time to use this key in real time and turn it without getting screwed by bad detection. Ooh, also, in Resident Evil Village VR, you have the ability to use your fists. So you can punch enemies, but the damage is negligible. It's like no damage whatsoever from the fist, so don't even try to use it in that regard. But what it can be useful for is for stunning enemies. And it's not just with fists, you can use the butt end of your weapon or pistol whip enemies as well in order to deal damage to them or stun them. The stuns only apply to the Lycans, though. You cannot stun the Morieka for some reason. I'm guessing because they're a very slow enemy, there's no real need for that, but it's still dumb either way that they can't be stunned. Yet the Lycans can be stunned, and Lycans are beefier than Moriekas in terms of their physiology. But moving past that, you can use your fists in such a way where you can stun lock Lycans so long as you hit them when they are not in a stunned animation. Because what happens typically is when you punch a Lycan, they go into a stunned state, a pretty hard stun, but if you punch them during that stunned state, they will not be stunned and they'll instead do an evade animation. And that can be a bit problematic, so you got to make sure that if you're trying to stun lock Lycans in order to open them up to your hits from the pistol, for instance, you always make sure you punch them when they're not in a stun state. Although sometimes this doesn't work, because even when they're in that neutral state of not being in a stun animation, they can sometimes not be stunned. And this happened a couple of times when I was doing the exterior stronghold encounter. So be very careful when you do decide to use your fists against Lycans. As long as you have high-powered weaponry like the shotgun or the sniper rifle, you'll be able to deal with the Lycans, and if you have mines as well, they can be very useful too. But I'll demonstrate those when I get the chance. Right now, we're dealing with Daniela, so make sure you turn on this lever immediately so that she doesn't immediately damage you. And all you have to do now is just lay into her with the pistol. So, cool thing about the pistol on this VR mode compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, there is no fire rate statistic in Resident Evil Village VR, so the fire rate is entirely dependent on how much you're pressing the fire button on your controllers. That is good design. In Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, for some reason, this is not the case, and the pistol can fire pretty slowly, but slightly faster than how it is in the original pre-alpha version. And it's the same case with the shotgun too, and I don't understand this as well, because in Resident Evil Village VR and also in Resident Evil 4 VR, the fire rate of the shotgun is entirely dependent upon your ability to pump the shotgun. The rate at which you pump the shotgun is your fire rate in Resident Evil 4 VR and Resident Evil Village VR, whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, this is not the case, and there is a fire rate statistic for your shotgun. It's a predetermined fire rate, even when you pump very quickly, which is pretty dumb. So there are times where even when you pump your shotgun, it can still feel like you're not able to fire, like you get an input drop, and it's pretty dumb. And there are also times in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR where even when I pump the shotgun, for some reason Leon doesn't fire, because the pre-alpha can have a bit of difficulty at times understanding if you pump the shotgun or not, and this isn't a thing in Resident Evil Village VR because you have an option in the settings menu called auto-cocking. And what auto-cocking does is it allows the game to automatically pull back on the slide on your shotgun, pull back on the bolt on your sniper rifle, or pull back on the slide on your pistol, and it saves so much time reloading because you only have to reload the magazines or shells into your weapon, and the rest of the process is just done by the game. And this ensures that you're not getting screwed by bad detection when you're pulling on the slide or when you're pulling back on the bolt. I mean, pulling back on the slide on the shotgun and on the pistol isn't so much of a problem, but with the sniper rifle, pulling back on the bolt is a big pain in the ass. The amount of times it got screwed by bad detection when I was trying to pull back on the slide without auto-cocking was really annoying. So with auto-cocking on, as long as I have both of my hands on my sniper rifle and I wait for a certain amount of time after a shot, the bolt is automatically pulled back, and it's a significantly faster fire rate than what it would be like just trying to pull back on the bolt myself and getting screwed by bad detection. and it's even faster than the fire rate on the sniper rifle in the main experience. So that is really good, and I don't know why Resident Evil 4 Remake doesn't have this mechanic. So there are times where it looks like I pull back on the slide on my shotgun, and somehow I just end up getting screwed by bad detection, and it's dumb. And I didn't actually see what pulling back on the bolt was like on the sniper rifle because I only bought the Stingray, and the Stingray is a semi-auto sniper rifle, not a bolt action sniper rifle. But I imagine it's pretty bad if this whole system of pulling back on the bolt with the sniper rifle is pretty clunky in Resident Evil Village VR, and they used Resident Evil Village VR as a template for Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But we're making our way over to Cassandra right now. I had to restart this part so many times on my very first recording before I ultimately gave up, and then after some time I decided to redo the walkthrough again, and I managed to get Cassandra on the second try. Cassandra is the worst daughter of the bunch, honestly worse than Bella because the room is not very good, and because of the fact that the floor is not a flat surface, relying upon the whole method of shooting Cassandra on the third hit of her combo doesn't work very well. And also, I just got so many moments where the turning animation kept on screwing me because it kept eating my input for the sprint. But what I do is, instead of using the pipe bomb, because trying to grab onto that barricade and pulling it out of the way is really painful because you have to put both of your hands on the barricade and hold the grab button and then move your hands, but the detection can be very clunky. And also, trying to pull your pipe bomb out of your coat very quickly after that, it is very spotty with its detection. And also, there are times where for some reason the throwing arc on the pipe bomb is incorrectly calculated by the game, and so it doesn't follow the path that you're expecting it to go, and so it goes like all the way off to the side or something, and so you end up missing the opening in the wall, and Cassandra just hits you with her flies. It's really annoying. So that is why you have to use a mine right there to bypass the poor design on the pipe bombs. But once that's done, you're able to fight Cassandra normally. Just do the same thing as you did with Bella before. Run away from the grab because of how bad its hit detection is, and then with the two combo attacks, keep your distance. Don't try to crouch under the combo attacks. It's just not worth it. I instead opt to use my shotgun and just launch so many shells into her face. It's just a lot more efficient that way. You can also use your sniper rifle as well to open up the fight, because if you keep your distance when you first break through the wall, and she starts coming after you, she will always do the running attack. I mean, sometimes she doesn't. I had a very rare moment where, rather than take the path that she normally does, she took the longest route possible to get to me, and because she wasn't within my line of sight, she didn't do the running attack, and she instead just ran up to me and did the grab attack, and I got screwed by that bad detection, and yeah, that was really weird. Lots of really weird behaviors like that in this VR version at times. But that fight is done. Now we can move on to Lady Dimitrescu herself. This fight isn't so bad. I think you can get it done a bit faster on the VR version, given the fact that the fire rate on the shotgun and the sniper rifle was greater in the VR version compared to the original version. And because of the fact that I took the time to deal with Bella with the pistol, and I used my shotgun on Cassandra, I have a lot more shotgun shells to spare to open up the fight with Alcina. And with the sniper rifle, because of the fact that the fire rate is pretty fast, even with auto-cocking on, and it's a lot faster than in the original version of Resident Evil Village, I can deal a lot more damage to Alcina this way. And given that this fight is pretty simple, and also, you saw right there, that was the auto-cocking feature. You notice that I didn't have to pull back on the bolt. I instead reloaded my magazine, and I was able to grasp the sniper rifle with both of my hands, and then the bolt automatically pulled back on itself. That is what the auto-cocking looks like. That is the kind of feature that is absent from Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I do not understand why. But given that we are talking about the guns, there's something I need to talk about. Compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, the shooting when you are using the iron sights on your weapons is a lot better for one reason. So, in Resident Evil Village VR, the game is very insistent upon you using both of your hands when you are firing your weapons. If you are only using one hand, the stability of your weapon is not very good, so your shots experience a lot more recoil, and you will miss your targets more frequently if you are only using one hand. Well, as a direct consequence of this particular design choice, they've actually improved the shooting with the pistol, because when you're aiming your pistol with both of your hands, the center part of the iron sight is forced to stay in the middle of the two other parts of the iron sight, the left and right hand sides of the iron sight. And so every time you are pointing at an enemy and you see that the middle part of the iron sight is directly on an enemy, you will never miss your shot. This is not the case in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. For some reason, in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, using both of your hands has no contribution whatsoever to the stability of your weapons. And as a direct result of this, the shooting in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR feels a lot like the shooting in Resident Evil Village VR when you are using only one hand. And so there are so many times in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR where when I'm using the pistol, even when it literally looks like the center part of my iron sight is directly between the left and right hand parts of the iron sight, I end up missing. And this is a pain in the ass during certain sequences, like in the minecart sequence. The minecart sequence forces you to rely upon the Red 9, and you cannot equip the laser sight on the Red 9. Do you have any idea how many times I missed my shots, even when the iron sight literally looked like it was lined up correctly on the enemy? If you want to know exactly what I mean, check out my blind playthrough of Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. The fact that this poor design is so problematic that you have to literally get the laser sight on your pistol to turn it into Resident Evil 4 VR shooting, so that you're not dealing with that poor design on the reticle and with the iron sight. That is absurd. I cannot believe New Capcom was that incompetent that they could make the shooting that bad and that dishonest in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. It just makes absolutely no sense. And another way to look at it is, when you're holding the pistol with both of your hands in Resident Evil Village VR, what happens is, if you're trying to like lean the pistol down or anything, the game is very resistant to you doing that. Like, you have to literally twist your wrist down a lot in order for there to be a visual representation of that in Resident Evil Village's gameplay when you're aiming the pistol with both of your hands. And so this is one of the main contributing factors to why it is very hard to miss with your pistol, and it is very hard for the iron sight to be dishonest in Resident Evil Village VR. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. Twisting your wrist down a bit is actually expressed in the gameplay. And so this is why there are a lot of moments where even when the iron sight is lined up correctly on an enemy, you just miss your shots. I originally thought it was the result of them translating Resident Evil 4 Remake's crappy shooting with the reticle-based system, the projectile-based nature of the bullets, the focus reticle system, the weapon sway, all that kind of stuff. I thought that was them poorly translating that into the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But it's not because of that. It's literally because they're using the framework of Resident Evil Village VR shooting when you're only using one hand as the default state when you're shooting your pistol in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. It is so frustrating. So, as the first step, when you're trying to build up your pistol in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, you've got to get that laser sight. And the thing I don't understand is, there is an option in the settings to equip the laser sight at all times. Like, there's a laser assist option in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, but the developers only restrict it to assisted and standard difficulty. So the fact that the developers are that incompetent to not even realize the whole importance of having laser sights in a VR experience where the iron sight is very dishonest, and this is the case with so many VR experiences where the iron sight is very dishonest, so you need a laser sighted system like that, which is why Resident Evil 4 VR shooting is really good compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake VR shooting. The fact that the developers didn't even realize that and they just restricted laser assist to assisted and standard difficulty is really retarded. And it's a good thing that Resident Evil Village VR's shooting does not need a laser sight, because the reticle you can actually trust. And every time I say reticle, I mean iron sight. I get the two mixed up a lot, but anytime your iron sight is directly on an enemy, when you have both of your hands on the weapon in Resident Evil Village VR, you will get your hits every time. I do not understand how this is possible. And there just seems to be a trend for Resident Evil 4 Remake shooting. Like, somehow, the original version of Resident Evil 4 Remake shooting ended up being worse than the shooting in Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, even though they aren't even as fast-paced as Resident Evil 4 Remake, or like what is supposed to be fast-paced in Resident Evil 4 Remake. And the designs that are put in place with the reticle system in Resident Evil 2 Remake and 3 Remake make a bit more sense when you're considering the overall designs of those particular experiences compared to the way the shooting is designed in relation to the overall experience of Resident Evil 4 Remake. And it seems this trend also extended to the VR version, so somehow Resident Evil Village VR shooting ended up being better than the shooting in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. So why is this a trend? Why is it that the prior Resident Evil titles have to be better in their shooting designs than with Resident Evil 4 Remake? And this extends not only the original version, but also the VR version. Why is new Capcom trying to satisfy that kind of trend? That really doesn't make any sense. Like, I can't believe the shooting could receive that kind of downgrade like that. That's ridiculous. But to sum it all up, guys, Resident Evil Village VR shooting is a lot better than the shooting in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. That is just ridiculous. I can't believe they could do that. At least the knife in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR is better than the knife in Resident Evil Village VR, because at least the knife has utility in Resident Evil 4 Remake compared to Resident Evil Village. And it's crazy the kind of changes that they made with the knife in Resident Evil 4 Remake, because for one thing, they've gone back to the old model with Resident Evil 2 Remake's knife designs, where you could actually deal multiple hits in a single knife slash. And it's the same case in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, so you can deal so much damage with the knife if you have your power statistic maxed out. And if you have the fully upgraded knife in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, you can have more hits with your knife slashes registered by the pre-alpha. So you can deal so much damage in the process, and you can annihilate mutated Krauser in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. I can't believe they could actually make that kind of improvement to mutated Krauser in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, yet completely ruin non-mutated Krauser in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. Like, his hitboxes are so broken now on the VR version compared to the original pre-alpha version. And if you want to know what I mean, just check out the video where I showcase how bad Krauser's knife fight in Chapter 11 is in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But that right there, that was a demonstration of the utility of the punch. Like I said, the punch allows you to stun Lycans when they are not in some kind of stun state. You can stop them during attack animations. I mean, sometimes it doesn't work though, like I've already explained. But it can be very useful. Just don't punch them again when they're in that stun animation, because they will do that evade animation. I mean, you can still punch them again, but like trying to use both of your fists when you're trying to use your weapons can be very awkward. So just try to use one hand for the punch and the other hand for another weapon like the pistol or the sniper rifle or the shotgun, and you'll be able to deal with them that way. I mean, then again, I could just use the butt end of the sniper rifle and the butt end of my shotgun as well in order to hit them, but I don't feel like the hit detection's as good when I'm trying to stun them. Oh, also, I just remembered the running attack that the Lycans can do, where they do that running grab on you. I mean, you can interrupt it with the punch, but you have to remain close to them after that, because even if you do stun them out of their running grab animation with that punch, they will actually re-engage the running grab immediately afterwards if you're far from them after that punch. So you do have to get close to them in order to force them to do the other grab that you can strafe away from. And again, the movement in Resident Evil Village VR is the same movement system as in the original version of Resident Evil Village. And that is a massive shame, because you're going to be dealing with that turning animation issue where it obstructs your sprint animation. It's really dumb that way, and that's definitely something I can say that Resident Evil 4 Remake VR does better than Resident Evil Village VR, because the movement system was entirely changed in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. That's what the developers said. So they pretty much made the movement exactly like Resident Evil 4 VR, where you can sprint in any direction. So like, even if you're facing in one direction, you can pretty much just initiate the sprint to the side or behind you, and it's really reliable that way, and it helps keep you on the move, and it helps you ensure that you're not getting screwed by turning animations, or when you're turning your head to look to the side and you're trying to sprint in that direction, but it's not registering properly because of the turning animation eating your input in Resident Evil Village VR. Like, that's non-existent in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, and that is a good thing that they did that. But right now, we have a bit of a breather moment to pick up some supplies and deal with some Lycans and some minor encounters. Just like what I did in my most recent version of my Resident Evil Village walkthrough, I'm going to skip out on Beneviento's area entirely, because there's no real threat there aside from the baby, and the baby's pretty easy to avoid, and Beneviento can be dealt with easily, so you're not going to see Beneviento's area in this particular walkthrough. And right now I'm taking the time to deal with these Lycans because I need some metal scrap, because I need a lot of mines, so I'm going to be dealing with Moreau. And I get rid of one Lycan. I'm going to use my punch on this one to set him up for a sniper rifle shot, but it failed because I didn't grasp onto the sniper rifle correctly earlier, so the bolt didn't get pulled back, so I wasn't able to fire my sniper rifle, but I pulled it out at the end, and he's dead, and I got some supplies in the process. But this whole system of punching Lycans in order to stun them, I wonder if that's meant to be a replacement for the push mechanic, because the push mechanic doesn't exist in Resident Evil Village VR, and it doesn't even matter anyway, because the push mechanic was absolutely useless in Resident Evil Village. There was no utility for that mechanic whatsoever. I only ever used it against one enemy for the entirety of Resident Evil Village. One enemy. So even though this mechanic doesn't exist, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but the inclusion of this ability to punch Lycans in order to stun them, it might make the combat a lot more engaging in certain parts. I mean, the combat was already pretty engaging with the Lycans anyway in certain scenarios. I mean, for the most part, you are running past the Lycans and the Morieka like 90% of the time. And then when you are dealing with the Lycans, it's mainly during certain encounters, and you generally just keep your distance and just hit them with the shotgun, or just use your mines against them. But, you know, I mean, the punch mechanic does spruce up the gameplay a little bit. That's what I'll say. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate when I got to the Stronghold Lycan encounter on the exterior. Well, I did get some interesting results. I did get some bad results as well, because, like I said, the stun can be kinda inconsistent randomly out of the blue, because that's just how Resident Evil Village's stuns can be at times with the Lycans, because sometimes they don't get stunned during very specific animations. Like, a great example of this is when you're using the sniper rifle on a Lycan and they dodge towards you. If you hit them during a very specific point in that dodge animation, and you hit them in the head, you don't get any kind of hit reaction for some bizarre reason. It's very weird. And I think there are also some other attack animations where they don't register any stun. Yeah, I don't know why the stun systems can be like that. But of course, in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, it's kind of worse in that regard, even though the shotgun is useful in a certain way in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But like, the enemies just run through your pistol shots like crazy, and then the stuns can be so inconsistent, and there's no guarantee you're going to get the animation that triggers the melee attack. It's definitely more of a gamble, I would say, with Resident Evil 4 Remake stun systems. And having brought up this discussion between Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake, it does bring up an interesting discussion. Like, in Resident Evil Village, you spend so much of your time just running past the enemies, relying upon exploits, and you engage in some minor combat encounters here and there, and then there are some boss fights, and yet somehow this feels a lot more engaging than Resident Evil 4 Remake. I mean, Resident Evil 4 Remake is longer than Resident Evil Village, that's for sure, but the way it tries to justify its length is not very good, and also the mechanics just don't have any substance to them. Like, they've somehow managed to take a lot of the interesting mechanics of Resident Evil 4 OG and just make them feel soulless. Like, even when you're doing, like, deflect systems, even when you're engaging in melee, even when you're doing some kind of interesting thing with the combat, it doesn't feel like it has a lot of weight or soul behind it. Like, somehow Resident Evil Village, a game where you spend more time running past the enemies and doing really stupid stuff with, like, your methodology, feels more engaging than a longer Resident Evil title that tries to pass off like it's some evolution to Resident Evil 4 OG when it's not, because it's easily the worst Resident Evil experience I've ever gone through. Like, even though it has a longer length, even though it has more combat to it, even though it has a bit more to its, like, substance at a superficial level when it comes to the combat systems, I mean, it doesn't feel as good as Resident Evil Village. Like, somehow Resident Evil Village feels like it has a lot more soul with it compared to Resident Evil 4 Remake. And I don't understand that that's possible, but it's just another example of how Resident Evil 4 Remake is a great example of another title that just redefines what it means to be an incompetent development team. And having mentioned all that, can I just say that the bosses in Resident Evil Village are a lot better than the bosses in Resident Evil 4 Remake? Like, almost every boss in Resident Evil 4 Remake is terrible. There's so many poor hitboxes, there's so much in terms of improperly thought out attacks, so many inescapable situations that you get put into a lot of the times with the bosses, like, so many moments where it just feels like the bosses are unfinished. I mean, I originally said that Moreau was the worst boss ever made in the entire Resident Evil series, and I played through other Resident Evil titles, and I don't think that anymore, but during my blind playthrough of Resident Evil 4 Remake, I did cite Moreau a lot as a reference in terms of bad boss design, but Resident Evil 4 Remake has one-upped the sheer stupidity that was displayed in Moreau's encounter. And speaking of which, we're doing it right now, and this boss fight is worse on the VR version. This is one of the main reasons why it is so hard for me to come back to Resident Evil Village VR, because of Moreau. Because my strategy that I use that gets rid of Moreau very quickly doesn't work very well because of the changes with the controls now in the VR version. But You'll notice that I opened up with my sniper rifle, and I was not able to use both my sniper rifle and my shotgun for obvious reasons, so I'm not going to be able to elicit the right amount of damage on Moreau initially, and right there I decided to use 2 pipe bombs at the start. Normally I do 1 stun, and then 2 pipe bombs like that, but I can't do that, so I have to change things up a bit. And I have a lot more pipe bombs now because I saved them from Castle Dimitrescu. But unfortunately, I did not deal enough damage to Moreau here, so he's going to be in the first threshold, where he's going to go up and do his Acid Rain attack, and I'm not going to be able to deal enough damage to force him to do the Acid Rain attack again, so I have to watch out for when he decides to go into the second Acid Rain attack and start walking into me, and he might potentially damage me if I'm not careful as he's walking up onto a roof to do his second Acid Rain attack. But like right now, I would be able to deal enough damage to Moreau while he's busy doing this to get him to do the second Acid Rain attack on the original version of Resident Evil Village, but I can't do that here because of the changes with the VR controls. So I'm having to improvise my strategy a bit, and it's going to make this a pretty messy encounter, and it's going to be very lengthy, and eventually I have to resort to the X-Play where I get him stuck on a wall and just hit his weak spot with the shotgun, and that will be enough, and then I can just finish him off with explosives. Yeah, it's a big mess. I don't know what they were thinking with Moreau here. I really wish there were better designs put in place on the VR version when dealing with Moreau. But you'll notice right here that this dodge I do, where I crouch at the right moment after shooting his weak spot, I use the pistol, not the shotgun, because I feel like the pistol is more accurate on the VR version compared to the shotgun, and I can at least hit the crouch button more efficiently when I'm using the pistol compared to using the shotgun here. But you'll see right here, Moreau is doing the incorrect taunt animation, so trying to ensure that I hit his weak spot properly with the mines can be very awkward if he does that particular taunt animation, because oftentimes he doesn't detonate the mine correctly. But at least it worked out for me, and now we're on the next phase, so he's going to do his Acid Rain attack again. So I don't have enough sniper rifle ammo, so I'm going to have to lay into him with the pistol right over here. And it's not going to do a lot of damage because I'm hitting his tail. I think if you hit his stomach, it does a lot more damage. It's too bad his weak spot isn't exposed during this. Seems very odd that Moreau is able to be inside of that mouth, and yet the acid doesn't douse him. Like, where does he go when that acid rain comes? It's a little bit weird like that, but yeah, it's just another example of Moreau just being a really bad boss. And look at him, he's just standing there now. Like, Moreau has so much trouble navigating the environment. I don't understand why they made these corridors so narrow for Moreau, where he has so much trouble navigating the environment. And at times he can just turn like that if he's in the middle of some kind of recovery animation where he's recovering from an attack, because during that recovery period he turns more efficiently. But right here, he's gonna get stuck right here. He's gonna just stand there for no reason. Like, he's gonna taunt right there, and it threw off his positioning, and now he's just going to stand there. So look at this. So I'm speeding up the video here. This is me shooting him with the shotgun. Like, this happens all the time with Moreau, and he takes so long to readjust himself so that he's aligned with the corridor. And I'm able to get him stuck on this wall right over here, so I'm going to be able to hit his weak spot, but I'm doing it wrong. I'm supposed to hit him at the very start of the attack animation, not at the end of the attack animation, and I just remembered that, so I need to correct for that. And then when I stun him with the shotgun blast, I'm going to finish him off with the pipe bomb, and that will be the end of this travesty of a boss fight. But this is less of a travesty compared to the bosses in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. But this is still an awkward encounter either way. I just wish they made this boss better for the VR version, but they didn't. I mean, it's just so messy, and he has so much life, too. And I just can't believe this whole bullet spongy nature and just being forced to use the merchant to upgrade your weaponry became such a standard that it impacted the balancing to such a heavy degree in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. And the thing is, I've gotten used to the Duke influencing the natural flow of gameplay in Resident Evil Village at this point, and I appreciate the fact that I can just sell my weapons and get a lot of treasure, and also get all this other treasure right here. But I mean, like, the way the merchant is interpreted in Resident Evil Village from a balance perspective and from a gameplay perspective, I feel like there is a distinct difference in the way it's handled compared to Resident Evil 4 Remilk, which I would consider to be worse with its quality. But I did get Resident Evil 4 Remilk done without using the merchant, but it was just such a mess. And I'm not gonna ever do no merchant ever again in Resident Evil 4 Remilk if I can help it. I mean, maybe I will, though, so I might contradict myself in that regard, but, you know, I'm not even, like, showing anything impressive with no merchant in Resident Evil 4 Remilk. And I just feel like the entire gameplay experience of Resident Evil 4 Remake is just so dependent upon the merchant with buying flash grenades, buying that crafting recipe, upgrading your weaponry so that you're not spending so much time in encounters and all this other crap. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I just feel like the merchant impacts Resident Evil 4 Remake more negatively compared to Resident Evil Village, and it's hard to explain, and I'll have to voice this somewhere in my retrospective of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Also, right there, that Varkalak, he somehow disappears. I don't know where he goes. I assumed he was just sitting by the doorway, but he's gone somehow. I'm not entirely sure where he went. I think he just despawned. But I did not know that was a thing that could happen with this Varkalak. But I'm able to get out of here. I'm going to get the grenade launcher and just move on to the stronghold in a moment. But yeah, guys, as I was saying, there's just something about the way the merchant was handled in Resident Evil 4 Remake that doesn't sit right with me even more than how it is already handled in Resident Evil Village. And again, this is something that I need to explain when I get to my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective, and I still don't know how long that retrospective is going to be. I mean, I'm already up to like 35 pages, and I've not even finished writing up the Village Siege Encounter Chapter 1, and I've only gotten up to the start of Chapter 2, because I just really want to finish up that Village Siege Encounter before moving on with the rest of Resident Evil 4 Remake. Because there's a lot I'm trying to talk about with the general fundamental mechanics and also with the fundamental flow of gameplay that is elucidated by this Village Siege Encounter, so that's why I'm having a lot of difficulties writing up that part. But I've reached the hour limit on Share Factory, so I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so now we have the encounter that takes place outside of the stronghold, and I'm about to demonstrate something very odd with the sequence, and this is only exclusive to Resident Evil Village VR, but for some reason, if I use this pistol, and I just repeatedly fire into the Lycan's head, just as the grab animation starts, I can cancel out the active frame period on the grab, so these Lycans are unable to grab me, and I think this is a combination of the increased fire rate provided by the new schema with the VR system, and also with Ethan's modeling and how it's read on the VR version, and the combination of these two factors seem to create this new kind of way to cancel out the grab animation entirely. And the thing is, this kind of thing does work in Resident Evil Village, but you have to actually crouch, and you have to shoot the Lycan at the right moment, I think in the arm mainly, in order to cancel out the grab, and I think you have to be on flat ground, or you have to be below them. This doesn't work if you're on an incline. I think this can still work if you're on an incline in Resident Evil Village VR. I have no idea why, but this is very interesting, and I'm able to do this first part of the sequence using only this pistol. Of course, it's probably better just to use the shotgun, but given the fact that I had to drain a lot more ammunition on Moreau this time around, given how badly designed he is on the VR version, I'm having to rely upon my pistol more in the sequence. And I'm also taking advantage of the counter system with the Lycans, where if I shoot them in the head, just as their attack animation starts, I can trigger that stun animation. And again, it's only working because I'm lower than the Lycan in terms of elevation. If I was slightly above the Lycan, or if I was on some flat ground that isn't read as flat ground by the game, I would not be able to get this counter that you're seeing right now. It's really dumb. I don't know why it works this way. It's really bizarre. This is some of the strangest programming that I've ever seen on a counter animation by far. I don't know what they were thinking with that. And at least the deflect system in Resident Evil 4 Remake doesn't have any kind of strange programming like that, but I do find it very bizarre how in Resident Evil 4 Remake, you can't deflect grabs. Like, you can deflect all these other attacks, and there are also some weapon attacks that you can deflect, but you can't knock back the enemy or stun them. Like, for instance, with the flail enemies or the stun rod guys, you try to parry those enemies in Resident Evil 4 Remake and nothing happens. And I question why they would put that kind of system in, where there are certain attacks that you can parry, but it doesn't actually cause a genuine stun on the enemy. It definitely disincentivizes you from partaking in the perfect parry system, because it's a waste of knife durability if you don't get any kind of payoff in the end. And at least with the stun rod guys, because it's the militia Ganado that only use that, and they have this very bizarre piece of programming where if they do an attack animation and you get behind them, the prompt to do the knife execution just appears for a second, so you can execute them. In that sense, the perfect parry is not that big of an issue there, and I will say the very idea of perfect parries draining your knife durability is a really silly idea. I don't understand why you have to punish the player for trying to partake in a very tight opportunity to parry an attack. Like in hardcore difficulty and the earlier difficulties, I could understand the partial parries draining your knife durability because they're not perfectly timed parries. But when you're talking about a perfect parry that requires you to press the parry button at a very precise moment, that should be all the skill you need, and the player should be punished in that regard for missing that timing. But when you nail that timing and you get punished anyway because of the fact that you lose durability, it doesn't make any sense. And relating this to the idea of the grabs, if the perfect parries are going to drain your knife durability anyway, then why do they not allow you to perfectly parry the grabs? Like, do you have any idea how much the enemies spam grab in Resident Evil 4 Remake? The Ganado in Resident Evil 4 Remake spam grab more than the Lycans do in Resident Evil Village. And the only time the Lycans are ever spamming grab is when you're close to them and you're strafing away. And at least Resident Evil Village has a better strafe mechanic than Resident Evil 4 Remake. I don't know what the hell they did with Leon's movement, but the strafing in Resident Evil 4 Remake doesn't feel like strafing, because the strafing feels just as fast as Leon's normal walk speed when it shouldn't be like that. That's not how strafing works. But of course, strafing wouldn't even matter anyway in Resident Evil 4 Remake, because all the enemies do is just running grabs, and then sometimes they'll do stationary grabs. But the developers were so lazy with the grabs in Resident Evil 4 Remake. They have the close range grab that the Ganado do just be the long range grab at close range, and it's literally them running into you. And the thing I don't understand is that they then designed the grabs to only be avoided by crouching under them. But the problem is, the crouch is very slow. Also, when the enemies are running into you when they're doing their close range grabs, they have this opportunity to do this banana grab where they literally track you the entire time as you're moving. And when the enemies are moving into you, when they're doing their running grab, they're pushing you all over the place, and they can just grab you at the end of the animation. And also, the detection on the enemy's grab is horrendous, because even when you crouch under it properly, you still get grabbed for no reason, even if you use the exact same timing that you used to avoid the grab initially when you crouched. Like, the grabs are so badly done. It is just a mess in terms of designs. And the grabs in Resident Evil Village, they aren't so bad, aside from Bella's grab. Bella's grab is the one that will catch you the most because of how awful the hitbox is. But of course, you can at least block the grabs. And blocking is a more effective countermeasure to enemy grabs, even though you do take damage through your grabs. But at least with the Moriekas, when they grab, you can actually block the grab and not incur any damage. But with Bella and the Lycans, it's a completely different story. But I would much prefer that than whatever system they have with Resident Evil 4 Remake, with utilizing a passive crouch mechanic to get under running grabs. You used passive crouching to avoid grabs in Resident Evil 7 as well, but it was against stationary grabs. The grabs were designed in such a way where the enemies only ever did stationary grabs. And the grabs were very lengthy, that you understood the attack was coming so that you could crouch under it properly. Like, that actually makes a lot of sense. They're not running into you and pushing you all over the place so that they can then just grab you at the end of the animation. I mean, what were they thinking with that? And I find it very bizarre that they would favor that kind of model rather than allow the player to deflect the grabs. If you could deflect the grabs, you would not only favor common sense, but you would at least lessen the impact provided by the poor designs on those grabs. And they didn't even have the common sense to design the grabs that way. I can't believe they could actually make the grabs worse in Resident Evil 4 Remake. And the grab animations in Resident Evil 4 Remake are the worst grab animations I have ever seen in a Resident Evil title. And people complained about the grabs in the older Resident Evil titles before Resident Evil 4 OG, but Resident Evil 4 Remake has one-upped the grabs in terms of their stupidity. I can't believe they could do that. And they have this whole system where you can shoot the enemy when they do the running grab at a distance, and it can stun them, but it doesn't work on the close range grab. And good luck trying to shoot the enemy when you're in the middle of crouching under that grab, because Leon, for some reason, is unable to aim and crouch at the same time, yet Ethan Winters can do that. Why do they not allow you to crouch shoot in Resident Evil 4 Remake? If you could do that, you could pretty much shoot the enemies when they're in their running grab animations and stun them, and avoid the risk of getting screwed by bad detection between the enemy's grab and yourself even when you crouch. It just doesn't make any sense, guys. The number of times the enemies spam grab in Resident Evil 4 Remake, and especially when you have multiple enemies together, because even when the enemies have their weapons, they have this tendency of spamming grab in order to put you into a full Nelson to set you up to be hit by other enemies. Like, they spam that animation like crazy. when enemies with weapons are less threatening than enemies without weapons, we have a serious problem here with game balancing, or in this case, pre-alpha balancing. I mean, that is seriously stupid. It really is. But I'm about to kill Aureus right here. The strategy for Aureus is still the same as what it was back in the original version of Resident Evil Village. Although I will say, though, it can be a bit awkward trying to swap between your weapons and, accessing your flash rounds in order to stun Aureus before he gets the chance to summon the Lycans. So you gotta make sure you plan accordingly with the way you set up your weapon slots. Oh, and also, this is very weird. For some reason, one of the crystals in this room right here has really weird hit detection. And it's the one up there. You see that one? That one, for some bizarre reason, even though my iron sight is directly on it, and you've obviously seen how accurate the shooting is in Resident Evil Village VR, it's somehow not registering the hit, so I can't knock this crystal down for some bizarre reason. I have to hit this thing multiple times from different angles, and then eventually it'll come down. It doesn't make any sense why this occurred. It's very weird, but eventually I get it down, and I believe I encounter a similar issue with one of the other crystals here. Yeah, just really weird detection. I did not expect that to be the case. And isn't it weird how Resident Evil 4 OG was the first Resident Evil title to introduce the idea of shooting flashing treasure and then picking it up, and yet for some reason this mechanic doesn't exist in Resident Evil 4 Remake? Seems odd that they would not introduce that mechanic again in Resident Evil 4 Remake, given how much the merchant influences the natural flow of gameplay a lot in Resident Evil 4 Remake. In fact, this brings to mind another tangent that I feel is worth discussing in my Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective, but in Resident Evil 4 OG, there were a lot of sequences where you had to rely upon your gun and shoot enemies in order to test the laser sight's accuracy. Like, they had all these little moments in Resident Evil 4 OG where you had to be very accurate with your shots in order to get certain sequences done. Like, for instance, the ski lift section in the final part of Chapter 2, or when you have to shoot that truck that's barreling down towards you, or when you have certain enemies on particular traps that you have to shoot. Like, they had little sequences like that, or like when you had to shoot dynamite out of an enemy's hand in order to kill a large group of enemies. Like, they had a lot of time devoted to certain sequences that tested the player's accuracy. And I feel like they did that in Resident Evil 4 OG to help players get accustomed to the laser sight, because I believe Resident Evil 4 OG was the first game to actually utilize the laser sight in the manner that it did, not just for like a stylistic change to the reticle system. Because the laser sight obviously works very differently to the standard reticle system in a typical game. But in Resident Evil 4 Remake, you don't get any moments like that, and I think this is a direct result of them changing the way the shooting works with the pistol, where they instead make the laser sight an optional thing that you have to get from the merchant, and a lot of the gameplay is designed around the projectile-based nature of the pistols and the reticle-based system, and the fact that you have to focus your reticle. So obviously, with those kind of limitations, you can't have those kind of sequences in Resident Evil 4 Remake, and it's very interesting making this kind of analysis, and I feel like I should point that out in my retrospective of Resident Evil 4 Remake. But we've now entered Heisenberg's factory, and Heisenberg's factory is very simple, but this boss fight is utter garbage in Resident Evil Village VR. I can't believe they could ruin the best boss of Resident Evil Village in this mode. And it's impossible to describe just how bad Heisenberg's boss fight is without first getting to it, so I'll hold off on discussing this right now. But a couple of things you need to realize is, since you're going to be interacting with the casting machine a lot in Heisenberg's factory, and you have to use the key items in real time and not just go into a separate menu, you're going to have to use flash grenades a lot in order to stun this Soldat Panzer so that you can get around the poor detection on placing the mold into the casting machine. Like, that detection right there is very awkward. Believe me, guys, you need to make sure you stun that Soldat Panzer. That's one of the main problems I have with VR experiences that force you to use key items in real time. And it's definitely one thing that I'm glad is not the case in Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. You actually have to go into the separate menu in order to use the key items, which is good. So the rest of the pre-alpha is paused, the enemies aren't moving, so you're not getting screwed by bad detection. And also, you're not having to waste time turning keys. In Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, when you place the key into the keyhole, the key automatically turns. You don't have to turn it yourself. So it's a good thing they made that choice compared to what it's like in Resident Evil Village VR. But right here, we have the gear room, so I'm going to take the time to destroy those gears. And I'm going to use the grenade launcher to get rid of that. Make sure you swap the flash grenades so that you can stun the haulers in this room right here. so that you can safely get through this room right here, because this is definitely one of the worst rooms in Heisenberg's factory. I just don't think there's a lot of intelligence put into how the hollers are placed, and also the gears can work against you because they trigger the wrong stun animations a lot of the times on the hollers, where they prioritize the eyepiece on the hollers rather than on the hollers themselves, and so they just bypass the gear system entirely. It's really stupid that that is the case. I mean, the idea of the eyepiece is a cool idea, but when it's complementing bad designs like that, that's very problematic. But after that, the rest of this is pretty simple. But you might have noticed that I was using my pipe bomb just then to break the wall. Well, there's no kind of system similar to Resident Evil 4 VR where you can hold your explosives off to the side and then you see a throwing arc, and when you release your grenade, it goes along that arc and it detonates at a certain point. Like, that system was very useful in Resident Evil 4 VR, and it definitely made certain parts of Resident Evil 4 VR really fun. Like, for instance, with the minecart sequence, because I could actually use flash grenades properly compared to the original version of Resident Evil 4. But at least Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR has a feature similar to this, where you not only have the ability to throw grenades, but there's also another setting where you can hold grenades in your hand, and then you hold, I believe it's the pointer finger button, to create a throwing arc, and then when you release the grab button, the grenade goes along that arc, which is a really nice design choice. And at least New Capcom had a bit of common sense, because they normally don't have common sense like that, and they actually took influences from Resident Evil 4 VR when designing the grenades in Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR. Although one design from Resident Evil 4 VR that is not included in Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR is the ability to pull the pin on the grenade. In Resident Evil 4 VR, you had the ability to pull the pin on your regular grenades, your flash grenades, and your incendiary grenades to trigger a time feature, and so you had a certain amount of time to throw the grenade away, so you could effectively cook your grenades. Like, that's exactly what it is. You had the ability to cook your grenades in Resident Evil 4 VR, and this was especially useful during the minecart sequence, because, you know, a lot of times in Resident Evil 4 OG, during the minecart sequence, I throw my flash grenade and it doesn't land properly on the environment, and so it doesn't detonate in the wrong spot, and so I end up missing. I mean, that doesn't happen often, but it can happen, whereas in Resident Evil 4 VR, if I use the pin feature, I'm able to make it where my flash grenade can detonate in the air. And this allows me more control over the encounter, and allows me to avoid any instance where my flash grenade doesn't land on the environment properly and detonate. So I can always ensure that I never miss the enemies that I'm trying to knock over with the flash grenade. And this feature isn't really needed in Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR. I haven't really found a lot of utility for such a feature, especially since a lot of the strategies that I'm using in Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR are pretty similar to the strategies that I've already utilized in Resident Evil 4 Remilk anyway. So, not really sure what the utility for such a mechanic would be in the first place. Oh, and also, in Resident Evil 4 Remilk VR, you can't play separate ways Remilk in the VR mode. I question why this is the case. I mean, I understand that in Resident Evil 4 VR, this was a different team to Capcom that was handling it, so they likely didn't have access to the full DLC of Separate Ways when they were designing the VR mode for Resident Evil 4. Whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, because it's new Capcom designing that mode, I'm surprised it didn't implement the VR mode into Separate Ways Remilk. But I'm guessing because of the fact that it's a DLC and it's separate to the main experience, it probably came with limitations that the VR mode couldn't account for. So that's probably why you can't do Separate Ways Remilk in the VR mode. Oh, this is something worth pointing out. That right there would never work in Resident Evil Village. In the original version of Resident Evil Village, there were certain attacks that looked like you could crouch under them, but you actually couldn't, because the hitbox was designed very poorly. Like, this was the case with the Morieka's horizontal attack. This was the case with that kind of attack right there with the stab. I mean, in that case, you could still crouch under it in Resident Evil Village OG, but you had to actually aim your gun in order to shift Ethan's hitbox in such a way that it actually made sense logically for him to crouch under that attack. Well, in Resident Evil Village VR, certain hitboxes are fixed. Like, that horizontal attack that the Morieka do, you can actually crouch under it now. So, I don't understand how that's possible. So, apparently during development of this VR mode, they somehow fixed a lot of the hitbox issues, yet they didn't fix hitbox issues like with the third hit of Bella's combo. So I question how they chose to prioritize certain hitboxes on the enemies when designing the VR mode for Resident Evil Village. But That right there is a pretty good design choice, but there's not a lot of utility for it, especially when you're going to be using flash grenades anyway in order to bypass the enemies. You can easily avoid the other enemies without having to put yourself in a position where you'll be crouching under these attacks that you wouldn't be able to crouch under in the original version of Resident Evil Village. So while this is a nice design choice, it really doesn't mean much in the end. Oh, and also, I just fought Sturm and I made a mistake. I forgot to equip the custom part for the Magnum to do more damage to Sturm, so I used up a lot more Magnum ammo than usual. It normally takes about 8 shots from a fully upgraded Magnum with the custom part included in order to take out Sturm, which is just ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense for that to be the case. Like, Sturm just drags out like that if you do not use the Magnum on him. And at least I took him down, and now we're on the worst boss fight in Resident Evil Village VR by far. They've taken the greatest boss in Resident Evil Village and they've absolutely ruined him. And it's not because of anything directly on Heisenberg, it's everything to do with the controls. The controls for piloting this particular vehicle that we're using right now is awful. Like, you have to use your right hand the entire time in order to guide exactly where you're aiming, but the game has so much trouble tracking exactly where you're aiming. Like, it's not one-to-one with where exactly your hand placement is in relation to the game. So, like, where Ethan's hand is right now is not necessarily where my hand is. And there are also times where, for some reason, Ethan can drop his weapon out of the blue. Almost like it gets some kind of latency issue between my controller and the actual game, and it just stops registering it for a brief second. It's really dumb. I just don't understand what QA was thinking with this stupid encounter. And you can see right here, I'm trying to fight the game right now. I'm just dropping my weapon, I'm raising it. Like, it's all happening right here because the game is not accurately tracking my hand. It's awful. I do not understand why there is not some kind of hybrid option for the control scheme for this vehicle. This part should work exactly like how it works in Resident Evil Village OG, where it's the thumbsticks that are guiding everything. You're using the right thumbstick to aim your turret. There's no kind of latency issue between your controller and the game itself when it's trying to read your hand placements or anything like that. They should have favored that model. And for the people that just wanted a genuine VR experience, they could have this. But for those who like to favor actual functional design and for actually complementing a really great boss fight, you could have the other option that I was talking about. I mean, what is wrong with the developers here? And there's no reticle or anything. You can't see where Ethan is aiming a lot of the times. And with the smoke everywhere and the other lighting effects, it can be very hard to tell exactly where you're aiming. And it's really annoying. And you have to make sure that you are not using your cannon too much if you're going to bypass a lot of these issues right here. But at least the strategy against Heisenberg still works, where I try to get around the attack that he does with his left hand, and then circle around him in such a way where I can avoid the attack that he does with his right hand. But the rest of the time, it's just a mess with this control scheme. Like, there are moves that I can stop easily in Resident Evil Village OG that on this VR mode, Heisenberg nearly comes close to hitting me a lot of the times with certain moves. I mean, this move isn't so much of a problem. I mean, I did fail a couple of times trying to stop that move, and it was my fault. It wasn't the game's fault, because my timing was off on when I was supposed to use the cannon. And look at that. I would be able to stop that move very quickly before he ever had a chance to charge. But with how bad the controls are, he almost hit me right there. It's so dumb. The entire time, I'm just praying that this stupid phase ends so that I can actually get to the final phase of Heisenberg where I can just pump him with a shotgun. And like this move right here, this is yet again another example of a move that I can stop without any issues in Resident Evil Village OG. But with this awful control scheme, Heisenberg can come very close to hitting me. It is so dumb. This has to be the most retarded moment in all of Resident Evil Village VR. I think QA were just smoking crack when designing that stupid section. And now we have Chris's section. So as you can see right here, Chris's Dragoon comes with a laser sight. So this is the only time you ever get to use a laser sight on a weapon in this game. And this section is still just as bad as how it is in Resident Evil Village OG. But I do think there are some minor improvements to the section in certain parts, but I'll discuss them when I get the chance. But we dispatched the first couple of Lycans. We're then going to run past these very pointless Varkalak. Why they're included here, it doesn't make any sense, and fighting them is a waste of time on Village of Shadows difficulty, because the mechanics betray you a lot. And now we have these guys right here. Also, by the way, during this entire section, when you're trying to use grenades, you have to pull the pin on the grenade. The game doesn't tell you this for some bizarre reason. And I didn't know this at the time of this recording, so there is going to be a moment where I try to use my hand grenades against a large group of Lycans, but the grenades aren't detonating because I forgot to pull the pin. And given the fact that Resident Evil 4 Remake VR didn't have any kind of pin option for the grenades, that's another reason why I thought I had to just throw the grenades like normal, but that's not the case here. You have to make sure you pull the pin back on the grenades in order for them to detonate. But we have this endless spawn of 2 Lycans occurring right now, and this guy comes very close to catching me. It feels like you can kill the enemies a lot quicker with the Dragoon in Resident Evil Village OG rather than on here. I don't know what it is, but at least the laser sight is a nice choice, and I do think the shooting is pretty accurate right here. But we get past these guys right here. There's that infinite Lycan again. And now I'm going to equip grenades, and at least the ability to swap grenades when they're in your hand is a nice touch, where you just hold the grenade out and press circle on your controller, just like Resident Evil 4 Remake VR. But right here, this is a fail. See, I thought the grenades worked like Resident Evil 4 Remake VR, but they're not detonating because I haven't pulled the pin on the grenade. But I make up for this blunder by pulling the grenade, and now I'm going to be able to dispatch these guys. I think I used way too many grenades on this part. I should have fallen back to the farmhouse so that I could actually stay up on my grenades and just dispatch the enemies when they were trying to come around the corner into the building. But right there, that was very fortunate that the guy didn't do the running attack. That's another problem with using the grenades here, because they generate smoke. You can't tell if a Lycan is doing the running grab attack, and they could easily hit you in the process. But right now, I'm just getting rid of these guys, and we have a couple more Lycans coming. Oh, and I just realized, because I'm playing as Chris, I think I can actually punch these enemies and they get knocked over. So that could probably be useful. I didn't realize that at the time, but now that I remember my first playthrough of the section, I believe Chris has the ability to knock over these enemies with his fist as a substitute to the push mechanic, and at least it works here, because in Resident Evil Village on Village of Shadows difficulty, Chris could not knock back the enemies with the push mechanic. It was broken. I do not know why. Like, Ethan has the ability to knock back Lycans with his legs, yet for some reason Chris tries to punch enemies whenever he pushes them, and nothing happens. They just get flinched for a little bit. Like, you see a little twitch in their face, and they just shrug off the hit for some bizarre reason. So it might also be in your best benefit to use the punch when you can. I don't even know if the punch can actually kill the enemies very quickly. I have no idea how much damage Chris's punches do in this section. And it's so really dumb how there's no kind of typewriter at the start of Chris's section. You have to play through Heisenberg's boss fight if you want to get to Chris's section, which is really retarded. But we're now doing the target locator section. So the target locator is located on my right arm, so I can pull that off of my right arm and then have my pistol at my side for the next phase of this encounter. This part right here, just dispatch the Lycans by shooting them when they try to climb. As long as you shoot them during the climbing animation, you can knock them back. It only takes 1 bullet, which is good. But see, this right here is a great example of how I can dual wield. So I can charge up the target locator, and then at the last moment, I aim it at the tower, and that will be the end of this phase right here. Now there's going to be a bunch of regular Lycans and armored Lycans coming my way. I'm going to equip the grenades first so that I can destroy the helmets on the armored Lycans, because the helmets allow the armored Lycans to recover from flash grenades quicker. So that's why you have to resort to using hand grenades first, then using the flash grenades. So throw all of your hand grenades, and it automatically swapped me to the flash grenades, which I didn't know. So I'm going to be using my flash grenades now to keep these armored Lycans off of me. But the target locator is ready. I'm going to try to hold off the regular Lycans, but the armored Lycans are not going to be flinched from my bullets, even when they're in the climbing animation. But luckily for me, the regular Lycans were very slow to come after me. And now that that's done, we're going to be able to take on Aureus Straw here, right here. It's a pretty simple encounter, so there's not much to really say. And then this will ultimately lead into Miranda's boss fight. And I don't really like Miranda's boss fight and the way it works in the VR version. That's yet another example of another boss that ruins the VR experience for me. But I'll explain why when I get to that boss fight. But just to go back on some other tangents, one thing I want to say about the Resident Evil 4 Remake retrospective is that it's not only a retrospective of Resident Evil 4 Remake and also Separate Ways Remake, but I'm also trying to use it as another retrospective for Resident Evil 4 OG and Separate Ways OG. So effectively, in this one retrospective, I'm critiquing 4 different products. So that is definitely a tall order that I'm imposing upon myself, and people don't seem to have a problem with it, and I'm definitely going to have a lot of fun doing that because Given that Resident Evil 4 Remilk is a reimagining of Resident Evil 4 OG, and it's the same case with Separate Ways Remilk being a reimagining of Separate Ways OG, it makes a lot of sense to compare to Resident Evil 4 OG and Separate Ways OG a lot. And that is allowing me to get more invested in the gameplay differences between the different products and also with the differences in the story. And already I know that Resident Evil 4 OG and Separate Ways OG are miles better than Resident Evil 4 Remilk and Separate Ways Remilk, but being able to put all of that into words to really elucidate the differences, I think is one of the most interesting experiences I'm ever going to do for a retrospective. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how exactly this is going to turn out. And you know, given the fact that I am critiquing 4 products, essentially, this is definitely going to be a very lengthy retrospective. And I mentioned before that I am still going to go through with it because given how lopsided Resident Evil 4 Remilk and Separate Ways Remilk are, and just how badly designed they are, and just how much they represented a new baseline in incompetency from a game development team, I definitely feel like that has to be complemented by a very lopsided retrospective, so that's definitely why I'm also doing this. But the length of this retrospective, I expect it to be roughly like 15 hours long. I mean, my Resident Evil Village retrospective was close to 7 hours long. My Shadows of Rose DLC retrospective was 3 hours long. And, you know, given that Resident Evil 4 Remilk is a significantly longer pre-alpha compared to Resident Evil Village, I definitely think the Resident Evil 4 Remilk retrospective will be greater than 7 hours, and it'll most likely be right around the 15-hour range. And it's definitely going to be the hardest project I've ever done in my entire life, honestly. And it'll be the most meaningful because, you know, the things I say in my reviews, the things that I want to be represented for when I do these retrospectives, it's all me, and I feel like there's a lot of value in the work I put into these retrospectives compared to what I do in my schools or what I did back in my terrible jobs and the like. It's hard to properly elaborate on these points, and I really don't see the need to elaborate on them right now, but all I'll say is I'm looking forward to doing this retrospective and really understanding the lore of the greater Resident Evil universe with the canon timeline that Resident Evil 4 OG is a part of, and just really showcasing just how bad the storytelling is in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, how dumb the developers were when designing Resident Evil 4 Remilk, how badly designed a lot of the gameplay scenarios are in Resident Evil 4 Remilk, and it'll be a treat for me personally, let me tell you. But we finished off Aurea Straw here, and we are making our way over to Miranda's boss fight after we sell a couple of things. So I made a mistake here. I forgot to fully upgrade the power statistic on my sniper rifle. I don't know how I blanked out on that. I managed to fully upgrade the clip capacity on my sniper rifle, yet completely blanked out on the damage statistics somehow. I mean, you can see right here I upgrade the clip capacity, but completely missed the damage statistics, so that was a blunder on my part, and I think that's why Miranda took a bit longer than usual, and I was really getting annoyed with that when it was entirely my fault. But we're in Miranda's boss fight. At least this is a better final boss fight compared to Sadler from Resident Evil 4 Remilk, or with Sadler in Separate Ways Remilk. I mean, Sadler in both of those pieces of content is the worst final boss fight ever in the entire Resident Evil series. This fight at least tries to stand out as a final boss fight. I mean, as I pointed out in my Resident Evil Village retrospective, it does suck that it doesn't feel as memorable or as impactful as what I went through dealing with Evelyn in Resident Evil 7. It's just the developers wanted to give a fight and nothing else, and so that's why it doesn't really hit the right notes with me personally. But I understand that there are some pretty interesting designs of Miranda. She can definitely be a really fun fight, but she just has a lot of life, and that's why it's best to fully upgrade your sniper rifle, and you can sell all your stuff, you can sell all your treasure. There's no possible way you're going to go into Miranda's boss fight with very little money to fully upgrade your sniper rifle. And the grenade launcher can be very helpful to destroy the projectiles that she spawns when she's in this flying phase right over here. But the sniper rifle can definitely help given the fact that it fires a lot faster on the VR mode. And having a lot of pipe bombs can be very helpful against Miranda because she takes a lot of damage from the pipe bombs. It's not the same case with the mines for some weird reason. I don't know why. The mine damage and the pipe bomb damage, they're entirely different. But the best way to use the pipe bombs against Miranda is to wait for her to spawn in the center of the arena, where she will then try to fire a volley of projectiles at you that you have to take cover from by hiding behind the mole tendrils. And during that entire animation, she is vulnerable to damage, so you can just throw so many of your pipe bombs at her, and she will go down very quickly. That's definitely the best way you'll want to handle Miranda on both versions of Resident Evil Village. But right now she's doing this move. If you stand directly underneath her and use your sniper rifle, you can pierce through her and also hit the Mega Mycete above her, and so it'll deal a lot more damage in the process. But the thing is, on the VR mode, if you have like a bright light on the ceiling and you decide to look up in order to try to hit Miranda by doing it the way I did it, the PSVR 2 will send you a warning saying that there's too much bright light shining into the headset, and so it will mess with the feed on your headset. I don't know why this is the case, because like the Oculus Quest 2, it needs the bright lights to actually track your environment, but apparently it's not the same case with the PSVR 2. It seems like having too much light is problematic for the PSVR 2, which is weird. And talking about the PSVR 2, can I just say that what you're seeing right now is the result of me having to put a filter on the video so that it doesn't look so dark. I don't know why this is the case, but whenever you're trying to capture footage using your PSVR 2, the footage comes out very dark, and I don't know why. So in order to counteract this issue, I literally have to go into Share Factory and apply a wash filter that brightens up the video so that it looks like normal, like it would be if I was just recording directly off my PS5. I've never seen that kind of issue like that with PSVR 2. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, but it would be nice if there was an option to increase the brightness of your video captures without having to literally go into Share Factory to apply a filter that brightens up the video. At least on the Oculus Quest 2, when you were capturing videos, the brightness was always right. It wasn't so dark or anything, but PSVR 2 is different, and I don't know why. So if you are planning on using your PSVR 2 to capture gameplay, you've got to be sure you go into Share Factory and apply that wash filter to your video so that you can bypass this issue where the video is very dark and very hard to see. Like I said, it's just a minor thing, so it's not that big of a deal, but it can be a big pain because every time you have to make edits in the video, you have to apply the filter again. It's pretty annoying, but I've gotten used to it at this point. And can I just say, guys, that there are not a lot of PSVR 2 games that are interesting to me. It's only Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake that have actually devoted time to their VR modes. I can't think of a single VR experience worth going through on the PSVR 2. It would be nice if Resident Evil 7 got the chance to be on the PSVR 2. I know there is a VR mode in Resident Evil 7, but I don't know what it's like. I don't think it's anything like the VR experiences in Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake. I think the VR mode in Resident Evil 7 was literally another change to the camera, but you still had to play the game like normal. Like, there wasn't any kind of ability to pick stuff up your body or anything. You still had to use the D-pad to select your weapons and stuff like that. So it was literally the original version, but you just controlled the camera via your head. I think that was literally all it was in Resident Evil 7 VR. I wouldn't know because I never bought the PSVR 1. I know Carcinogen SDA has footage on his channel where he did play Resident Evil 7 in the VR mode. I don't know if he still has the video on his channel, but I'll have to see what it's like on his end. And also right there, I finished off Miranda. And this final phase is really stupid, because even when you're holding your gun during these little moments where cutscenes are happening, for some reason the gun goes back in your holster, so you have to try to pull it out from your holster, but the detection can be very weird, so I nearly failed right there because I was struggling with the detection just then. And right here, the game forces my gun to go back into the holster, so I have to struggle with the detection again, and I nearly get caught right there, but I managed to pull through. I'm going to time my shots to finish off Miranda, and that will be the end of my Resident Evil Village VR walkthrough. So thank you very much for watching, and you take care now.